We remember Winston Churchill as the bulldog leader who saved civilization in 1940. But 15 years earlier, he made a calculation that would snap the financial spine of the British Empire forever. He chose to put the British economy into a straitjacket crafted from gold, believing it was a suit of armor. He wanted the pound to look the dollar in the eye, to pretend the devastation of World War I had never happened. But as the brilliant John Maynard Keynes warned, he wasn't just fixing a currency, he was declaring war on the working class. This is the story of how an empire sacrificed its factories, its mines, and its future on the altar of a yellow metal. The world before the fall. It's 1914, and Britain rules the waves. The pound sterling is the reserve currency of the world. From Cape Town to Calcutta, from Hong Kong to Halifax, merchants settle accounts in British pounds. The City of London is the beating heart of global finance. British banks finance railroads in Argentina, mines in South Africa, plantations in Malaysia. 1/4 of the world's population lives under the Union Jack. But here's what made Britain truly powerful: the gold standard. Every pound note could be exchanged for a fixed amount of gold, and the bank would hand it over without question. This convertibility made the pound as good as gold anywhere on Earth. The war that changed everything. Then came August 1914. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo, and within weeks, Europe descended into mechanized slaughter on an industrial scale. Britain, which had spent centuries carefully managing its finances, suddenly had to fund a war of unprecedented cost. The numbers are staggering. In 1914, British government spending was around £200 million. By 1918, it had exploded to nearly £3 billion annually. Where did this money come from? Britain did three things it had never done before. First, it borrowed massively, from its own citizens, from America, from anyone who would lend. Second, it printed money. The printing presses ran night and day, flooding the economy with paper pounds. Third, it did something previously unthinkable. It abandoned the gold standard. On September 19th, just 1 month into the war, the Treasury made a quiet announcement. The convertibility of pounds to gold was suspended. It was supposed to be temporary, emergency measures for emergency times, but this decision would haunt Britain for the next 2 decades. By November 1918, when the guns finally fell silent, Britain had won the war but lost its financial dominance. The economy was twisted beyond recognition. National debt had increased by 1,000%. Inflation had more than doubled prices. British exports, once the engine of global trade, had collapsed as factories turned to producing shells and ships instead of textiles and machinery. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, America had transformed from a debtor nation to the world's great creditor. American banks now held British IOUs worth billions. Wall Street was challenging the City of London's centuries-old supremacy. British elites looked at this new world with horror. The natural order had been inverted. The pound, which had been the measure of value itself, was now just another inflated currency. Something had to be done. In 1924, a man stepped into the Chancellor of the Exchequer's office with a solution. His name was Winston Churchill, and he had a plan to restore Britain's glory. He would bring back the gold standard at the old pre-war rate. Britain would pretend the war had never happened. The pound would be as good as gold again, anchored at $4.86 to the pound, exactly what it had been in 1914. It sounded like patriotism. It sounded like restoring the natural order. There was just one problem. It was economic insanity. And one man saw it coming. John Maynard Keynes was 41 years old in 1925, and he was already the most famous economist in the world. He had made his reputation with a devastating book about the Treaty of Versailles, predicting that the harsh reparations imposed on Germany would lead to economic catastrophe and another war. He had been right. Now, Keynes was about to make another prediction, and once again, no one wanted to listen. Keynes understood something that the political establishment refused to accept. You cannot simply decree that your currency is worth what it used to be. Value is determined by economic reality, not nostalgia. Here's the problem in simple terms. During the war, Britain had printed money and borrowed heavily. This increased the money supply, which caused inflation. Prices in Britain had roughly doubled. Meanwhile, British industry had fallen behind. Factories were outdated, productivity had stagnated, and competitors in America and Germany had modernized. In economic terms, the pound was overvalued at the old pre-war rate. The true value, based on Britain's actual economic strength, was probably closer to $4.40, not $4.86. That 10% difference might sound small, but it would prove catastrophic. Winston Churchill was not an economist. He was a politician, a historian, a romantic who believed in Britain's imperial destiny. When his advisors presented him with the option to return to gold at the pre-war parity, he saw it as a matter of national honor. Churchill's reasoning went like this. Britain's greatness rested on financial prestige. The City of London's dominance required trust. Trust required stability. And stability meant the pound must be as solid as it had always been. To return to gold at any rate lower than the pre-war level would be an admission of defeat, a declaration that Britain was diminished. His advisors at the Bank of England reinforced this view. Montague Norman, the governor of the Bank of England, was obsessed with returning to gold. He believed it was a moral imperative, a return to financial discipline after the wartime chaos. Norman was a curious figure, mystical, prone to nervous breakdowns, but absolutely certain about gold. Churchill later admitted he had doubts. In private conversations, he questioned whether the return to gold might harm British workers, but in the end, he deferred to the experts. It was the worst decision of his political career. In July 1925, just months after Britain returned to the gold standard, Keynes published a pamphlet with a provocative title, The Economic Consequences of Mr. Churchill. The title itself was a shot across the bow. It deliberately echoed Keynes's famous book about Versailles, The Economic Consequences of the Peace. The message was clear. Churchill's decision would be as disastrous as the Treaty of Versailles. Keynes's argument was elegant and brutal. By overvaluing the pound, Churchill had made British goods 10% more expensive on world markets overnight. British coal, British steel, British textiles all suddenly became less competitive against American, German, and Japanese competitors. For British industry to compete at this overvalued exchange rate, one of two things had to happen. Either prices had to fall or costs had to be cut. But prices are sticky. They don't fall easily. That left only one option. Wages had to be reduced. Keynes put it bluntly. The policy of improving the exchange by 10% was, sooner or later, a policy of reducing everyone's wages by 2 shillings in the pound. Think about what this means. A coal miner earning £5 a week would need to accept £4 to make British coal competitive. A textile worker would have to take a pay cut. Every worker in every export industry would have to accept less, work harder, or lose their job entirely. Keynes was predicting a class war, and he was right. Churchill and his supporters had a counterargument. They believed the return to gold would force efficiency. British industry had become complacent, protected by wartime contracts and government subsidies. Exposure to international competition would be healthy medicine. Weak firms would fail, strong ones would adapt, and Britain would emerge leaner and more competitive. This was economic Darwinism applied to nations, survival of the fittest. It sounded tough-minded and realistic. But Keynes understood something his opponents did not. Economies are not made of statistics and balance sheets. They are made of people. Real workers who cannot simply accept 20% wage cuts without consequences. Real families who cannot afford bread when unemployment soars. Real communities that collapse when the mines close and the factories shutter. The gold standard defenders also argued that returning to gold would restore confidence and attract foreign investment. Money would flow back to London, reinforcing Britain's position as the financial capital of the world. This argument had some merit in the short term. The return to gold did indeed attract gold reserves back to London. Foreign investors saw the pound as stable again. But this was fool's gold. The underlying economy was being slowly strangled. Within months of Churchill's decision, the first cracks appeared. Coal mine owners announced they could no longer afford to pay current wages. They demanded pay cuts of up to 25%. The miners refused. A confrontation was inevitable. What happened next would shake Britain to its foundations and reveal the true cost of the golden straitjacket. The British working class was about to pay for Churchill's currency decision with their livelihoods, their communities, and in some cases, their lives. On May 3, 1926, Britain experienced something it had never seen before, a general strike. Over 1.7 million workers walked off the job in solidarity with coal miners facing devastating wage cuts. Trains stopped running, docks fell silent, newspapers ceased publication. For 9 days, Britain's industrial heart stopped beating. This wasn't a spontaneous uprising, it was the direct result of Churchill's gold standard decision. Here's how the chain of causation worked. British coal was already struggling to compete with Polish and German coal in European markets. When the pound was overvalued by 10%, British coal became even more expensive. Mine owners, squeezed by falling export revenues, demanded wage cuts of 13 to 25% and longer working hours. The miners refused. Their slogan was simple and devastating: not a penny off the pay, not a minute on the day. These weren't radical revolutionaries. They were men who worked in darkness, breathing coal dust, risking their lives daily in dangerous conditions. The proposed cuts would push many families below subsistence. The Trades Union Congress called for a general strike in support, and for 9 days, the British establishment stared into the abyss. Churchill as strikebreaker. During the general strike, Churchill took on an unlikely role: newspaper editor. When the regular papers stopped publishing, Churchill helped produce a government propaganda sheet called the British Gazette. In its pages, he painted the strike as a revolutionary threat to constitutional government. But the strike wasn't revolutionary, it was defensive. Workers were trying to maintain living standards that the gold standard was destroying. Churchill couldn't or wouldn't see this. To him, the strike was a challenge to order itself, and it had to be crushed. The government broke the strike by mobilizing middle-class volunteers to keep essential services running, and by deploying the army to maintain order. After 9 days, the Trades Union Congress called off the general strike, though the miners held out alone for another 7 months before starvation forced them back to work on the owners' terms. The miners lost. Wages were cut, hours increased, pits closed. Mining communities in Wales, Yorkshire, and Northumberland were devastated. Families that had worked coal for generations faced poverty and displacement. And the tragedy was that none of it was necessary. The crisis existed because Churchill had artificially overvalued the pound. He had chosen to make British goods more expensive for the sake of financial prestige. The miners' defeat was just the beginning. Throughout the late 1920s, British industry struggled under the burden of the overvalued pound. Unemployment, which had been high since the war ended, remained stubbornly above 1 million. In industrial regions, it was much worse. In some mining towns, unemployment reached 50% or more. British exports continued their decline. In 1913, Britain had been the world's largest exporter of manufactured goods. By 1929, it had fallen behind both America and Germany. The once mighty textile industry of Lancashire was in terminal decline. Shipbuilding on the Clyde was a shadow of its former self. Meanwhile, London's financial sector prospered. The city had indeed retained its position as a global financial center. Banks made money lending abroad, financing foreign projects, and managing the empire's finances. But this created a bizarre disconnect. The financial sector thrived, while the industrial base crumbled. Britain was becoming a rentier economy, living off the returns from past investments rather than current production. It was hollowing out. The human cost of the gold standard is difficult to quantify, but we can glimpse it in fragments. Public health statistics showed rising malnutrition in industrial areas. Surveys of working-class families revealed endemic poverty. The middle class shrank as professional salaries failed to keep pace with the cost of living. Perhaps most tragically, Britain's young men bore much of the burden. Those who had survived the trenches of World War I returned to an economy that had no use for them. Unemployment among young men reached devastating levels. An entire generation felt betrayed. They had fought for their country, and their country had abandoned them to economic irrelevance. Working-class communities developed a deep cynicism about the political establishment. If the government could crush the miners to defend the value of the pound, what else might it sacrifice? This cynicism would have political consequences that echo to this day. By 1928, even Churchill began to have doubts. In private letters, he expressed regret about the return to gold. He could see the unemployment figures, he could see the industrial decline, but he was trapped by his own decision. To abandon the gold standard now would be to admit that the policy had been wrong from the start. Keynes, meanwhile, watched his predictions come true with grim satisfaction. He had been right about everything: the overvaluation, the wage pressures, the unemployment, the social unrest. But being right brought no pleasure. His country was suffering, and the suffering was preventable. In his lectures and writings, Keynes developed a more sophisticated critique of the entire gold standard system. He argued that tying currency to gold created artificial constraints that prevented governments from responding to economic crises. When recession hit, governments needed flexibility, the ability to lower interest rates, increase spending, or let their currency adjust. The gold standard removed these tools. He was developing the ideas that would later revolutionize economics. The concept that governments could and should manage demand, that unemployment was not a natural phenomenon requiring wage cuts, but a failure of aggregate demand requiring stimulus. But in 1928, these ideas were still heretical. The establishment clung to gold standard orthodoxy even as the evidence of its failure mounted. Then came 1929. The Wall Street crash in October sent shockwaves through the global economy. What had been a slow economic stagnation in Britain suddenly became an emergency. The gold standard, which Churchill had restored to provide stability, was about to reveal itself as a suicide pact. And this time, Britain would not suffer alone. The entire world economy would be dragged down into the Great Depression, with the gold standard serving as the mechanism of contagion. October 1929. Stock prices in New York collapsed, wiping out billions in wealth. American banks failed by the thousands. Credit dried up overnight. International lending stopped. And because America had been financing much of the world's trade and development, the entire global economy seized up. Britain, already weakened by 6 years of the overvalued pound, was hit particularly hard. British exports collapsed further as global trade contracted. Unemployment, already over 1 million, began climbing toward 3 million. The industrial North faced conditions approaching famine. And the gold standard made everything worse. Here's why. When economic crisis hit, the normal response would be to lower interest rates to stimulate borrowing and investment, and to let the currency depreciate to make exports more competitive. But the gold standard prevented both options. To maintain the fixed gold parity, the Bank of England had to keep interest rates high to attract gold reserves. High interest rates meant less investment, less business expansion, less job creation. It was the exact opposite of what the economy needed. Countries on the gold standard were locked together in a death spiral. When one country deflated its economy to maintain gold convertibility, it reduced imports from other countries, forcing them to deflate as well. This competitive deflation dragged everyone down. In 1931, Britain faced a financial crisis. The budget deficit was growing, unemployment benefits were straining public finances, and critically, foreign investors began doubting whether Britain could maintain the gold standard. Gold began flowing out of the country. The response from the political establishment was austerity. Both the Conservative and Labour parties agreed that the budget must be balanced. This meant cutting spending precisely when the economy needed stimulus. It meant reducing unemployment benefits when unemployment was soaring. In August 1931, the Labour government collapsed over the question of benefit cuts. A national government was formed, a coalition of conservatives, liberals, and some Labour members united around one goal: maintaining the gold standard at all costs. But the costs were unsustainable. Workers faced wage cuts, benefit cuts, and unemployment. And for what? To maintain the convertibility of pounds to gold at an arbitrary rate set in 1925 based on a world that no longer existed? September 1931. Liberation. On September 21, 1931, Britain finally abandoned the gold standard. The Bank of England announced it would no longer convert pounds to gold at the fixed rate. Sterling was allowed to float, and it immediately depreciated by about 25%. The reaction was dramatic. The political establishment treated it as a national humiliation, a sign of British decline. Newspapers ran apocalyptic headlines. But something unexpected happened. The economy began to recover almost immediately. With the pound depreciated, British exports became more competitive. Interest rates could be lowered, stimulating investment. Industry could breathe again. Unemployment began to fall. The recovery wasn't dramatic. The depression lingered through the 1930s, but Britain's economy performed significantly better than countries that clung to gold longer, like France and the United States. The abandonment of gold standard revealed an astonishing truth. The source of Britain's problems for 6 years had been the gold standard itself. The policy Churchill had implemented to restore British greatness had been strangling the economy the entire time. Britain's experience with the gold standard between 1925 and 1931 teaches us several crucial lessons about economics and politics. First, the lesson about symbols versus reality. The gold standard was a symbol of stability and prestige, but it was economically destructive. Churchill chose the symbol over the reality, and millions of British workers paid the price. Second, the lesson about expert consensus. Churchill deferred to the Bank of England, to the Treasury, to the financial establishment. They were all wrong. Sometimes experts are captured by ideology or institutional interests. The lone dissenter, Keynes, was right. Third, the lesson about policy rigidity. The gold standard removed flexibility from economic policy. When circumstances changed, governments couldn't adapt. This inflexibility turned a manageable problem into a crisis, and a crisis into a catastrophe. Fourth, the lesson about who pays. The burden of the overvalued pound fell disproportionately on workers, miners, factory workers, the unemployed. The financial sector, the rentiers, those living off investments did relatively well. Economic policy is never neutral. It distributes gains and losses, and in this case, the losses were concentrated among those least able to bear them.